The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Blackwood mansion with that peculiar quality which seems to mock the sorrows of the humble and illuminate the follies of the great. Eleanor Hartwell had risen before dawn, as was her custom, to begin the interminable tasks that comprised her existence as headmaid in this monument to material success. Her hands, though weathered by years of service, moved with practiced efficiency as she prepared the grand dining room for Mr. Alexander Blackwood's breakfast, a ritual as precise and unforgiving as the man himself. How strange it is that poverty should teach one to observe so keenly the habits of wealth. In her 28 years upon this earth, Eleanor had learned to read the subtle signs that preceded disaster, much as a sailor reads the sky before a storm. And this morning, as she arranged the crystal glasses and polished silverware with mechanical precision, a foreboding settled upon her heart like frost upon a window pane. Mr. Blackwood descended the marble staircase at precisely 7:30, his footsteps echoing through the cavernous hall with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. At 45, he possessed that commanding presence which wealth and power confer upon their favorites, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by distinguished silver at the temples, and eyes of such a penetrating blue that they seemed to see through to one's very soul. Yet for all his apparent perfection, Eleanor had observed in him a restlessness of late, a distraction that spoke of troubles even vast fortune could not resolve. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," she murmured, stepping forward to pour his coffee with the deference that her station demanded, though her spirit remained unbroken by servitude. He barely acknowledged her presence, his attention consumed by the thick document that lay beside his place-setting, a legal paper bound in blue backing, its pages covered with the small, cramped writing that lawyers use to obscure meaning rather than illuminate it. Eleanor had seen such documents before. They were the instruments by which the powerful bound themselves to courses of action they might later rue, and she had learned to fear them as a child fears the dark. "Shall I prepare your usual breakfast, sir?" she inquired, though she knew his answer as well as she knew the pattern of her own breathing. "Yes, yes," he replied absently, his fingers drumming against the polished mahogany table as his eyes scanned the document's contents. There was something in his manner, a tension, a barely suppressed excitement, that set Eleanor's nerves on edge. She had served in this household for 7 years, ever since her father's death had left her without protection or provision, and in that time she had grown to understand the subtle language of her employer's moods. As she moved about her tasks, laying out the finest china and preparing the elaborate meal that would begin another day in the life of one of the city's wealthiest men, Eleanor found herself stealing glances at the mysterious document. From her position near the serving board, she could make out portions of the text, and what she read filled her with a growing sense of alarm. The paper bore the letterhead of Cromwell and Associates, a firm whose reputation was known even to those in service. They were not the sort of lawyers one consulted for routine matters of business, but rather the kind who specialized in ventures of a more speculative and dangerous nature. The fragments she could discern spoke of investments, of partnerships with individuals whose names she did not recognize, and of sums so vast that they made her head spin with their magnitude. Eleanor had been born into poverty, but she had not been born a fool. Her father, God rest his soul, had been a clerk in a modest firm before drink had claimed him, and he had taught her to read and cipher with a skill that exceeded what was common among her class. More importantly, he had taught her to think, to question, to observe, gifts that had served her well in her years of service, though they had also been the source of considerable suffering. The breakfast preparations complete, she retreated to the serving pantry to await Mr. Blackwood's summons, but she could not shake the feeling that she was witnessing the prelude to some great calamity. Through the partially open door, she watched as he continued to study the document, his brow furrowed in concentration, occasionally making small marks in the margins with his gold fountain pen. At length he looked up and called for her. "Eleanor, send word to my driver that I shall require the car at 9 o'clock. I have business in the city that cannot wait." "No, yes, sir," she replied, but as she turned to carry out his instruction, she found herself compelled by some force she could not name to speak again. "Sir, if I may be so bold." He looked at her with surprise, for it was not her habit to offer unsolicited observations. Indeed, her position in the household was maintained precisely because of her ability to perform her duties with silent efficiency, never presuming to insert herself into matters that were not her concern. "Well, what is it, Eleanor?" His tone was not unkind, but there was an impatience in it that warned her to choose her words carefully. She hesitated, acutely aware that she was treading upon dangerous ground. The line between servant and master was not one that could be crossed lightly, and yet the conviction that had seized her would not be denied. "I could not help but notice the document you have been studying, sir. The letterhead, Cromwell and Associates. They are known for ventures of a rather uncertain nature." Mr. Blackwood's eyes narrowed, and for a moment she feared she had overstepped beyond all possibility of forgiveness. "And what business is it of yours, may I ask? What manner of ventures I choose to pursue?" The rebuke stung, but Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "None whatsoever, sir, and I humbly beg your pardon for the presumption. It is only that—" She paused, struggling to find words that would convey her concern without further offending his dignity. "In my father's time, sir, I had occasion to learn something of business matters, and documents of this nature often contain provisions that are not immediately apparent to the unwary reader." She expected anger, perhaps even dismissal, but instead she saw something unexpected flicker across his features, a moment of uncertainty, quickly suppressed, but not quite quickly enough to escape her notice. It was then that she understood the true nature of his situation. For all his wealth and apparent confidence, Alexander Blackwood was a man out of his depth, about to commit himself to something he did not fully comprehend. "I am perfectly capable of managing my own affairs," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "I have consulted with my regular legal advisors, and they have found nothing objectionable in the terms." Eleanor felt her heart sink, for she recognized the stubborn pride that would not admit to doubt even when doubt was warranted. She had seen it before in her father, in the men and women who had fallen from grace and found themselves reduced to seeking employment in houses like this. It was the pride that goeth before a fall, as the scriptures warned, and it was more dangerous than any external enemy. "Of course, sir," she murmured, but as she turned once more to leave, she was struck by a sudden inspiration. "Sir, might I ask, have you shown this document to Miss Catherine?" The effect of her question was immediate and startling. Mr. Blackwood's composure, which had remained largely intact despite her previous impertinences, cracked visibly. His face darkened, and she saw his hands clench into fists upon the table's surface. Miss Catherine Fairfax was Mr. Blackwood's ward, a young woman of 23, whose parents had died in a carriage accident when she was but a child. She had been raised in this house, educated at the finest schools, and treated in all respects as the daughter Mr. Blackwood had never had. More than that, she possessed a keen intellect and a thorough understanding of business matters that rivaled many men twice her age. If anyone could advise Mr. Blackwood on the wisdom of his intended course, it would be she. "Miss Catherine," he said slowly, "is currently abroad, completing her studies at the University of Cambridge. She is not expected to return for several months, and this matter cannot wait for her convenience." There was something in his tone that suggested this timing was not entirely coincidental, and Eleanor felt her suspicions deepen. She knew Miss Catherine well, had watched her grow from a precocious child into a remarkable young woman, and she knew that the young lady would not hesitate to voice her concerns if she believed her guardian was making a mistake. Perhaps that was precisely why Mr. Blackwood was so eager to conclude this business in her absence. "I see," Eleanor said carefully. "It is only that Miss Catherine has always shown such wisdom in matters of this nature. Her absence seems unfortunate." "Mr. Blackwood rose from his chair with a suddenness that made the crystal glasses ring against each other. His height and bearing seemed to fill the room, and Eleanor was reminded forcefully of the vast gulf that separated them in station and circumstance. Yet she did not retreat, for something greater than self-preservation was driving her now, a conviction that she was witnessing the destruction of a good man through his own blindness and pride. "I will thank you to remember your place, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Your concern for my welfare, while touching, is neither sought nor required. I am quite capable of conducting my affairs without the assistance of my ward or my servants." The words were meant to wound, and they succeeded. Eleanor felt the familiar sting of humiliation that was the constant companion of those who lived by the charity of others. Yet even as shame heated her cheeks, she found herself thinking not of her own wounded feelings, but of the larger tragedy that was unfolding before her eyes. "Yes, sir," she whispered, lowering her gaze as convention demanded. "I meant no offense." But even as she spoke these words of submission, her mind was racing. She thought of all she had observed in her years of service, the subtle signs that had preceded other disasters she had witnessed, the way powerful men could be led astray by their own arrogance, the terrible consequences that fell not only upon themselves, but upon all who depended upon them. The servants, the tenants, the countless others whose livelihoods were tied to the Blackwood fortune, all would suffer if this venture proved as disastrous as she feared. Mr. Blackwood returned to his seat and took up the document once more, but she could see that her words had affected him more than he cared to admit. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages, and twice she saw him pause over passages that seemed to give him pause. Yet his pride would not allow him to acknowledge doubt, much less seek counsel from one so far beneath his station. The morning advanced with painful slowness. Eleanor went about her duties with mechanical precision, but her thoughts remained fixed upon the scene in the dining room and the document that lay upon the table like a serpent coiled to strike. She found herself remembering stories her father had told her of great fortunes lost through reckless speculation, of proud families reduced to penury by ventures that had promised much and delivered only ruin. At 8:30, Mr. Blackwood summoned her once more. "Eleanor, you will prepare the blue room for guests who will be arriving this afternoon. They are associates of mine from the Cromwell firm, and they are to be received with all due courtesy." "Yes, sir," she replied, but inwardly she despaired. The presence of lawyers from Cromwell and Associates could mean only one thing. The signing would take place this very day, before there was time for second thoughts or the intervention of cooler heads. As she busied herself with preparations for the unwelcome visitors, Eleanor found herself thinking of Miss Catherine, so far away and unaware of the disaster that was about to befall the household she had called home. The young woman had always been kind to Eleanor, treating her with a respect and consideration that was rare among those of her class. More than that, she possessed the intelligence and strength of will that might have prevented this catastrophe, if only she had been present to do so. But she was not present, and the responsibility, if such it could be called, fell upon Eleanor alone. The question that tormented her was whether she possessed the courage to act upon her convictions, knowing full well that to do so might cost her the position upon which her very survival depended. She was not a young woman, and positions for those of her age and circumstances were not easily obtained. To lose her place in the Blackwood household would likely mean destitution, perhaps even the workhouse, a fate she had seen befall others and had sworn never to suffer herself. Yet as she worked, polishing furniture and arranging flowers in the blue room, she could not shake the memory of Mr. Blackwood's face as he studied that accursed document. Beneath his apparent confidence, she had glimpsed something that chilled her to the bone, the look of a man who had already made up his mind to proceed despite his doubts, driven by forces he could not or would not name. The morning sun climbed higher, its rays slanting through the tall windows with increasing intensity, and with each passing moment, Eleanor felt the weight of decision pressing down upon her. She thought of her father, of the wisdom he had tried to impart to her about the duty we owe to one another, regardless of station or circumstance. She thought of the other servants in the household, good people whose welfare depended upon the continued prosperity of their master. Most of all, she thought of Mr. Blackwood himself, proud, stubborn, blind to his own danger, and she knew that she could not simply stand by and watch him destroy himself. The question was not whether she should act, but how. Direct confrontation had already proven futile. Indeed, it had only served to harden his resolve. She needed a different approach, something more subtle yet more decisive. As she pondered this dilemma, her gaze fell upon the telephone that sat upon the writing desk in the corner of the blue room, a modern marvel that connected the mansion to the broader world beyond its walls. An idea began to form in her mind, terrible in its audacity, yet irresistible in its logic. If Mr. Blackwood would not listen to the counsel of his servants, perhaps he might yet be persuaded by voices that carried greater authority. The document bore the signatures of men she did not know, but surely there were others, business associates, friends, perhaps even family members, who would share her concern if they were made aware of the situation. Yet even as this possibility presented itself, Eleanor was forced to confront the magnitude of what she was contemplating. To take such action would be a betrayal of trust so profound that it would surely mean not only her dismissal, but her utter ruin. Word would spread through the network of great houses, and she would find herself unemployable, marked forever as a servant who had dared to meddle in her master's affairs. The sound of carriage wheels upon the gravel drive interrupted her tormented deliberations. Through the window, she could see a black coach drawing up before the main entrance, elegant, expensive, and somehow ominous in its very perfection. As she watched, two men alighted, one elderly and distinguished with silver hair and the bearing of a gentleman, the other younger, perhaps 40 years of age, with features that seemed pleasant enough, but eyes that held a calculating coldness that made Eleanor shiver. These, then, were the agents of Cromwell and Associates, come to complete whatever business they had begun. Eleanor found herself studying them with the intense scrutiny of one who knows that lives may hang upon the ability to read character in a face, to discern truth from falsehood in a gesture or expression. What she saw did nothing to ease her growing alarm. The elderly gentleman, Mr. Cromwell himself, she assumed, moved with the careful precision of one who had spent a lifetime in the practice of law. There was about him an air of respectability that was undoubtedly calculated to inspire confidence, yet Eleanor detected something beneath the surface that troubled her, a hint of the predator concealed beneath the veneer of professional courtesy. His younger companion was less successful at concealment. Eleanor had grown skilled at reading the faces of those who wielded power over others, and in this man's features she saw the unmistakable marks of greed and ambition. He surveyed the mansion's facade with unconcealed avarice, his gaze lingering upon the costly appointments and architectural details as if already calculating their worth. As the two men approached the entrance, Eleanor made her decision. Whatever the cost to herself, she could not stand idly by while disaster unfolded. The method of intervention was less important than the intervention itself, and if she lacked the authority to prevent this catastrophe through direct action, she would find another way. Moving with purposeful haste, she made her way to the servants' quarters, where she knew she would find Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, preparing for the day's activities. Mrs. Pemberton was a woman of 60 years, possessed of the kind of practical wisdom that comes from a lifetime spent in service to the great houses of England. If anyone could advise Eleanor on how to proceed, it would be she. "Mrs. Pemberton," Eleanor began, keeping her voice low despite the urgency she felt, "I must speak with you on a matter of the utmost importance." The older woman looked up from her ledgers with the patient expression of one accustomed to dealing with the various crises that arose in the daily management of a large household. "What is it, my dear? You look as though you've seen a ghost." "I fear I may have seen something worse," Eleanor replied, and quickly related what she had observed and overheard in the dining room. Mrs. Pemberton listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grave as the tale unfolded. When Eleanor had finished, the housekeeper sat in silence for a long moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap as she contemplated the implications of what she had heard. Finally, she spoke, her voice heavy with the weight of years and experience. "Child, what you describe troubles me greatly, but you must understand the position in which we find ourselves. Mr. Blackwood is master of this house, and it is not our place to question his decisions, however unwise they may appear to us. We are servants, not advisors, and to forget that distinction is to court disaster of our own. But surely, Eleanor pressed, when we see our master walking toward a precipice, we have some duty to cry out a warning." "Perhaps," Mrs. Pemberton conceded, "but consider the source of such a warning. We are women of humble station, possessed of no expertise in matters of business or law. What weight could our counsel possibly carry against that of learned men with impressive credentials? Mr. Blackwood would dismiss us as ignorant meddlers, and he would not be entirely wrong to do so." Eleanor felt her heart sink as she recognized the truth in the older woman's words. Yet something within her rebelled against this acceptance of powerlessness. "Then we are to do nothing. We are to stand by and watch while he destroys himself and all who depend upon him? Sometimes, my dear, that is precisely what duty requires of us. We must trust that our betters know best, even when all our instincts cry out against their choices." But Eleanor could not accept such resignation. As she left Mrs. Pemberton's quarters and returned to her duties, she found herself thinking not of the prudent course but of the right one. The distinction between the two had never seemed more clear or more painful. The morning wore on with agonizing slowness, each minute bringing the moment of decision closer. Eleanor went through the motions of her work, receiving the visitors, seeing to their comfort, ensuring that all was prepared for the business that was to follow, but her mind remained fixed upon the catastrophe she felt powerless to prevent. At 11 o'clock, she was summoned to the library, where Mr. Blackwood had assembled with his visitors around the massive oak table that dominated the room. The document lay spread before them, its pages gleaming white in the morning sunlight that streamed through the tall windows. Eleanor served coffee and withdrew to her station by the door, where she could observe the proceedings while remaining unobtrusive. What followed was a masterpiece of persuasion, conducted with all the skill that wealth and experience could command. The two lawyers spoke in measured tones of the opportunities that awaited, of the vast profits to be earned by men of vision and courage. They painted pictures of a future so golden that it seemed almost within reach, requiring only the simple act of placing one's signature upon a piece of paper. Mr. Blackwood listened with rapt attention, his earlier doubts seemingly forgotten in the face of such compelling rhetoric. Eleanor watched in growing horror as she saw him being drawn deeper into their web, his natural caution overcome by appeals to his pride and ambition. These men were masters of their craft, and they had clearly studied their target well. As the morning progressed toward noon, Eleanor realized that her moment was rapidly approaching. Soon, very soon, Mr. Blackwood would take up his pen and commit himself to a course that would bring ruin upon all who depended upon him. If she was to act, it must be now, while there was still time to prevent the irreversible. The weight of decision settled upon her shoulders like a physical burden, and she found herself thinking of all that hung in the balance. Her own future, the welfare of her fellow servants, the fate of a man who had been a fair master despite his faults. All of these considerations pressed upon her consciousness as she stood in that sunlit library, watching the final act of a tragedy unfold. And then, as Mr. Blackwood reached for his fountain pen with a hand that trembled slightly with excitement or nerves, Eleanor made her choice. The sound that escaped Eleanor's lips was neither planned nor calculated. It was the involuntary cry of a soul witnessing calamity. The delicate china cup she had been holding slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering upon the Persian carpet with a crash that seemed to echo through the vast library like thunder in a cathedral. All eyes turned toward her, and in that moment of universal attention, Eleanor felt the full weight of her presumption settle upon her shoulders. Mr. Blackwood's face darkened with annoyance, while the two lawyers regarded her with the cold displeasure of men whose important business has been interrupted by the clumsiness of a mere servant. "Eleanor, Mr. Blackwood said, his voice carrying a warning that she recognized all too well. "Please see to that mess immediately, and try to conduct yourself with more care." But as she knelt to gather the fragments of broken porcelain, Eleanor found herself possessed by a strange clarity of purpose. The moment of her choosing had arrived, not through careful planning, but through the accident that fate sometimes provides to those who require it most. She looked up from her position upon the floor, meeting her master's gaze with a directness that violated every rule of proper conduct between servant and employer. "Sir," she said, her voice steady despite the thundering of her heart, "I must speak with you privately on a matter of utmost urgency." The silence that followed her words was profound and terrible. Mr. Cromwell cleared his throat with obvious displeasure, while his younger associate made a show of consulting his pocket watch, as if to emphasize the valuable time being wasted by such an unseemly interruption. Mr. Blackwood himself seemed momentarily stunned by her audacity, his pen suspended above the document as though frozen in time. "Eleanor?" he said at length, his tone carrying all the authority of his position and the warning of consequences to come. "You will attend to your duties and leave us to conduct our business in peace." But something had been set in motion that could not now be stopped. Eleanor rose to her feet, the fragments of china clutched in her hands like evidence of her own shattered composure, and took a step closer to the table where the three men sat in their fine clothes and comfortable certainty. "I cannot, sir," she replied, and though her voice trembled, her words carried a conviction that surprised even herself. "I have observed certain matters that compel me to speak, regardless of the consequences to my position or person." Mr. Cromwell leaned back in his chair with the air of a man who had witnessed many such domestic disturbances and found them tedious beyond measure. "Really, Blackwood, is this the sort of discipline you maintain in your household? Perhaps we should postpone our business until you have dealt with this situation." The suggestion clearly stung Mr. Blackwood's pride, and Eleanor saw his jaw tighten with anger. She knew that she had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat, but the knowledge only strengthened her resolve. If she was to be ruined for her presumption, she would at least ensure that her ruin served some purpose. "The discipline of my household is not in question," Mr. Blackwood said coldly, never taking his eyes from Eleanor's face. "Eleanor, you will remove yourself from this room immediately, and we shall discuss your behavior at a more appropriate time." "Sir," Eleanor pressed on, knowing that each word carried her further from any hope of redemption, "I have had occasion to examine the document before you, and I believe there are provisions within it that may not be entirely what they appear." The younger lawyer, Mr. Thornfield she had heard him called, laughed with genuine amusement. "Good Lord, Cromwell, the servant fancies herself a legal expert. What entertainment these domestic creatures provide!" But Mr. Cromwell did not laugh. Instead, Eleanor noticed his eyes had grown sharp and alert, like those of a predator sensing potential danger. "What possible expertise could a housemaid possess in matters of commercial law?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. Eleanor felt the full weight of their combined scrutiny, and knew that her next words would determine not only her own fate, but possibly that of everyone in this house. She thought of her father's teachings, of the long evenings spent poring over documents and accounts, of the skills that poverty and necessity had forced her to acquire. "My father, before his death, was employed as a clerk with Hartwell and Sons, specializing in commercial contracts," she said, grateful that her voice remained steady. "I assisted him in his work from a young age and learned to recognize certain irregularities in legal documentation. It was not the complete truth, Her father's employment had been modest, his expertise limited, but it was not entirely false either. More importantly, it was enough to give her words a weight they might not otherwise have possessed. Mr. Blackwood's expression had shifted from anger to something approaching curiosity. "What irregularities do you claim to have observed?" Eleanor moved closer to the table, acutely aware that she was venturing into territory where one misstep could prove fatal to all her hopes. "The clause regarding liability limitation in Section 7, sir. It appears to place the entire risk of loss upon the investor rather than distributing it among all parties to the agreement." She had, in truth, observed no such thing, but she had noticed that Section 7 was the portion of the document that Mr. Blackwood had studied most intently, returning to it repeatedly with expressions of concern. It was a calculated guess, but one based upon careful observation of his behavior. The effect of her words was immediate and startling. Mr. Thornfield's face flushed red, while Mr. Cromwell's carefully maintained composure slipped slightly. Most telling of all, Mr. Blackwood himself turned his attention back to the document with sudden intensity, his finger tracing along the lines of text as if seeing them clearly for the first time. "That section," Mr. Cromwell said smoothly, "is perfectly standard in agreements of this nature. Miss, what is your name again?" "Eleanor Hartwell, sir," she replied, noting how he had attempted to diminish her by affecting to forget her identity. "Miss Hartwell," he continued, "is clearly misunderstanding the technical language employed. I assure you, Mr. Blackwood, that all provisions have been carefully crafted to ensure fairness to all parties." But Mr. Blackwood was no longer listening to the lawyer's reassurances. His attention was focused entirely upon the document, and Eleanor could see him rereading the section she had mentioned with growing concern. Whatever was written there, it was clearly not as benign as he had been led to believe. "Mr. Cromwell," he said slowly, "perhaps you could clarify the exact meaning of this passage. The language does seem rather complex." Eleanor felt a surge of hope, quickly tempered by the recognition that she had only gained a moment's respite. The lawyers would undoubtedly find ways to explain away whatever concerns had been raised, and her intervention might prove to be nothing more than a temporary delay. She needed something more substantial, some piece of evidence that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. As Mr. Cromwell launched into a detailed explanation of the clause in question, Eleanor found herself studying the two men with renewed intensity. There was something in their manner, a tension, a barely concealed anxiety that suggested her random guess had struck closer to the mark than she had dared hope. Mr. Thornfield, in particular, seemed unable to sit still, his hands fidgeting with his papers and his eyes darting nervously between his senior colleague and Mr. Blackwood. It was then that Eleanor noticed something that made her pulse quicken with excitement. Among the papers scattered across the table was what appeared to be a second copy of the contract, and from her position she could see that certain sections had been marked with penciled notations. The handwriting was different from that of the main document, and the markings seemed to indicate revisions or corrections. Without allowing herself time to consider the consequences, Eleanor took another step forward, ostensibly to clear away more fragments of the broken cup, but actually to get a closer look at these mysterious annotations. What she saw there made her blood run cold with the certainty of disaster narrowly averted. The penciled notes were in Mr. Thornfield's hand. She had observed his writing when he signed the guest register, and they clearly indicated provisions that differed significantly from those in the final document. Where the completed contract spoke of shared profits, the annotations suggested a much more limited return for Mr. Blackwood's investment. Where the final version mentioned safeguards and protections, the notes indicated clauses that would leave him vulnerable to unlimited liability. Eleanor's mind raced as she absorbed the implications of what she was seeing. This was not merely a case of unfavorable terms or questionable legal language. This was deliberate fraud, a systematic attempt to deceive Mr. Blackwood about the true nature of what he was signing. The realization filled her with a mixture of triumph and terror, for she now possessed knowledge that could save her master, but might very well destroy her. "Sir," she said, interrupting Mr. Cromwell's lengthy explanation, "might I suggest that you have your own legal counsel review this document before you sign? It would be the prudent course, given the magnitude of the investment involved." Mr. Thornfield's reaction was swift and telling. He reached across the table as if to gather up the papers, but stopped himself just in time, clearly realizing that such an action would only call more attention to whatever he was trying to conceal. "That would be quite unnecessary, Mr. Cromwell said, his voice carrying a note of impatience. "We have already spent considerable time explaining every provision, and further delay would only complicate matters unnecessarily." But Mr. Blackwood was beginning to show signs of the caution that had served him well in his business dealings. Eleanor's intervention, however presumptuous, had given him pause to consider what he had been about to do, and she could see doubt creeping into his expression. "Perhaps Eleanor has a point," he said thoughtfully. "This is indeed a substantial investment, and I have always made it my practice to seek independent counsel on matters of such importance." The two lawyers exchanged a look that Eleanor did not like at all. There was something predatory in their expressions, a calculating coldness that suggested they would not be easily deterred from their purpose. She realized with growing alarm that men who would attempt such a brazen fraud would not hesitate to take more direct action if their schemes were threatened. "Of course," Mr. Cromwell said with false joviality, "if you insist upon additional review, we can certainly accommodate such a request. However, I must warn you that this opportunity is time-sensitive. Our other investors are eager to proceed, and any delay on your part might result in your exclusion from what promises to be a highly profitable venture." It was expertly done. The suggestion of scarcity, the implication that hesitation would mean missing out on vast wealth, the gentle but unmistakable threat that delay would have consequences. Eleanor had seen such tactics employed before in her father's business, and she recognized them for what they were, the tools of those who sought to pressure others into unwise decisions. "Nevertheless," Mr. Blackwood replied, and Eleanor felt a surge of pride at the firmness in his voice, "I believe I shall take a day or two to consider the matter further. Surely such a brief delay cannot materially affect the opportunity." The mask of professional courtesy was beginning to slip from Mr. Cromwell's features, revealing something harder and more dangerous beneath. "I fear you misunderstand the urgency of the situation, Mr. Blackwood. We have made special arrangements to include you in this venture, but those arrangements depend upon your immediate commitment. If you cannot provide that commitment today, we shall be forced to seek other investors." Eleanor found herself holding her breath as she watched the battle of wills unfold before her. On one side stood her master, a man of wealth and position, but clearly out of his depth in dealing with predators of this caliber. On the other were two experienced manipulators who had undoubtedly practiced their craft upon many previous victims, perfecting their techniques through repetition and success. The outcome hung in the balance, and Eleanor knew that whatever happened in the next few moments would determine the fate of everyone in the household. She had done what she could to raise doubts in Mr. Blackwood's mind, but she had no illusions about the power of professional manipulation when applied by skilled practitioners. It was then that inspiration struck her with the force of divine intervention. Among the papers on the table, she had glimpsed what appeared to be a telegraph form, perhaps a communication from the mysterious investors who were supposedly so eager to proceed with the venture. If she could somehow get a closer look at that document, she might find additional evidence to support her case. Without pausing to consider the wisdom of her action, Eleanor stepped forward once more, this time making a show of reaching for the coffee service that sat near the edge of the table. As she did so, she allowed her sleeve to brush against the stack of papers, causing them to scatter slightly and giving her a clear view of the telegraph. What she read there was even more damning than she had dared hope. The message, dated just 2 days earlier, was from someone identified only as H. Morrison and read, "Blackwood investigation proceeding satisfactorily. Subject appears ideal for our purposes. Wealthy, isolated, and lacking sophisticated legal counsel. Recommend proceeding with utmost speed before he has opportunity for second thoughts." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as she absorbed the full implications of what she had discovered. This was not merely a case of unfavorable business terms or even deliberate fraud. This was a carefully orchestrated conspiracy designed to separate Mr. Blackwood from his fortune through systematic deception. The men sitting at his table were not legitimate businessmen, but professional swindlers who had studied their target and planned their approach with meticulous care. The knowledge that she now possessed was both powerful and terrifying. With it, she could certainly prevent Mr. Blackwood from signing the fraudulent contract, but she could also find herself in mortal danger if these men realized what she had discovered. Professional criminals of this caliber would not hesitate to silence anyone who threatened their schemes, and her humble station would provide no protection against their ruthlessness. Yet even as fear coursed through her veins, Eleanor felt a strange sense of clarity and purpose. She had stumbled upon evidence of a crime that would not only ruin her master, but likely destroy the lives of everyone who depended upon him. Whatever the personal cost, she could not allow such a catastrophe to unfold when she possessed the power to prevent it. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice cutting through the tense negotiations like a blade, "I believe there is something you should see." All conversation ceased as every eye in the room turned toward her. She could feel the weight of their attention like a physical pressure, and she knew that her next words would either save the household or doom them all. Mr. Cromwell's face had gone very pale, while Mr. Thornfield's hand had moved instinctively toward his coat pocket in a gesture that did nothing to alleviate Eleanor's growing fear. "Eleanor," Mr. Blackwood said, his voice carrying a warning that she chose to ignore, "I have told you that this is not your concern." But Eleanor was beyond the reach of warnings now. She had crossed too many lines to retreat, and the only path that remained was forward, regardless of where it might lead. With hands that trembled only slightly, she reached across the table and picked up the telegraph form, holding it out toward her master with a gesture that seemed to encompass all the courage she possessed. "Sir," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos of emotions within her, "I believe you should read this message before you proceed any further." The silence that followed was so profound that Eleanor could hear the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Mr. Blackwood took the telegram with obvious reluctance, his face reflecting confusion and growing anger at her continued presumption. But as his eyes scanned the brief message, she saw his expression change with devastating swiftness, from annoyance to comprehension to a fury so cold and terrible that it seemed to fill the entire room. When he looked up from the paper, his gaze fixed not upon Eleanor, but upon the two men who sat frozen in their chairs like rabbits caught in the sudden glare of a hunter's lamp. The transformation in his demeanor was complete and startling. Gone was the uncertain businessman being led toward disaster, replaced by a man of power and intelligence who had finally recognized the true nature of his situation. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying all the authority of his position and the weight of his righteous anger, "I believe we have concluded our business. Eleanor, please show these men to the door." But Mr. Cromwell was not prepared to surrender so easily. Rising from his chair with the fluid grace of a predator, he fixed Eleanor with a stare that made her blood run cold with its implications of future retribution. "I think, my dear," he said softly, "that you may have made a very serious mistake." The threat contained within Mr. Cromwell's soft-spoken words hung in the air like smoke from a smoldering fire, acrid and suffocating in its implications. Eleanor felt her courage waver for the first time since she had committed herself to this dangerous course. But she forced herself to meet his malevolent gaze with what composure she could muster. She had chosen her path, and there could be no retreat now, whatever the consequences might prove to be. Mr. Blackwood, however, seemed to grow in stature as the full scope of the deception became clear to him. The uncertainty and confusion that had marked his demeanor throughout the morning had vanished, replaced by the cold fury of a man who had discovered that his trust had been systematically betrayed. When he spoke again, his voice carried an authority that brooked no argument. "The mistake, Mr. Cromwell, appears to have been entirely on my part. The mistake of entertaining such obvious charlatans in my home." He rose from his chair with deliberate slowness, his imposing figure seeming to dominate the room, despite the presence of two men who had clearly spent their lives learning to intimidate others. "I suggest you collect your papers and leave immediately, before I decide to summon the authorities." Mr. Thornfield, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, suddenly found his voice. "You cannot prove anything," he said, though the tremor in his words betrayed his growing desperation. "That telegram could mean anything. It proves nothing illegal or improper." Eleanor watched this display of bravado with the fascinated horror of one witnessing the final throes of a dangerous animal. These men were cornered now, their carefully constructed scheme exposed and ruined, and she knew from bitter experience that such creatures were never more dangerous than when facing their own destruction. "Perhaps not, Mr. Blackwood replied with icy calm, "but I suspect that a thorough investigation of your business practices and associates might reveal patterns of behavior that would be of considerable interest to the proper authorities. I am, as you may recall, not without influence in certain circles." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable, and Eleanor saw both men recognize its implications. Mr. Cromwell's face had taken on a greyish pallor, while Mr. Thornfield's hands had begun to shake with barely controlled rage. They were professional criminals facing the prospect of exposure and prosecution, and Eleanor realized with growing alarm that their next actions might be desperate and violent. "You will regret this interference," Mr. Cromwell said, his gaze shifting from Mr. Blackwood to Eleanor with malevolent intensity. "Both of you will regret it most deeply." Indeed, the promise of retribution was delivered with such quiet venom that Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. These were not men who would accept defeat gracefully, and she understood with terrible clarity that she had made enemies who would not forget or forgive her role in their downfall. Yet even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, she found strength in the knowledge that she had prevented a catastrophe that would have destroyed not only her master, but everyone who depended upon him. "Mr. Blackwood moved toward the bell pull that would summon the footman, but Mr. Cromwell raised a hand to forestall him. "That will not be necessary," he said with forced dignity. "We shall take our leave voluntarily. Come, Thornfield. We have no further business here." The two men began gathering their papers with hasty, fumbling movements that spoke eloquently of their desire to escape before the situation deteriorated further. Eleanor watched their retreat with a mixture of relief and lingering apprehension, knowing that while this immediate danger had passed, the larger threat they represented might well continue to menace the household. As they moved toward the door, Mr. Cromwell paused beside Eleanor's position and leaned close enough that she could feel his breath upon her cheek. "Remember, my dear," he whispered, his words audible only to her, "we know where to find you. This is not over." The words struck her like a physical blow, but Eleanor forced herself to stand firm, meeting his threatening gaze with all the courage she could summon. She would not give these villains the satisfaction of seeing her cower, whatever her private fears might be. When the library door finally closed behind the two men, the silence that followed seemed almost deafening in its intensity. Eleanor found herself alone with Mr. Blackwood for the first time since this crisis had begun, and she was acutely aware that the full reckoning for her actions was yet to come. She had saved him from financial ruin, but she had also violated every protocol that governed the relationship between master and servant, and she could not expect such transgressions to pass without consequence. "Mr. Blackwood moved to the window and stood looking out at the street below, perhaps ensuring that his unwelcome visitors had indeed departed the premises. When he finally turned back to face her, his expression was unreadable, a mixture of emotions too complex for her to decipher. "Eleanor," he said at length, his voice carefully controlled, "I find myself in the unusual position of owing a profound debt of gratitude to one of my servants. Your intervention today has saved me from what would undoubtedly have been complete financial ruin." She felt a surge of relief at his words, but it was tempered by uncertainty about what would follow. Gratitude, she had learned, was a complex emotion among the wealthy, often accompanied by resentment at the circumstances that had made it necessary. "I am glad that I was able to be of service, sir," she replied carefully, "though I fear I overstepped the bounds of my position in doing so." "Do." A slight smile played about the corners of his mouth, the first genuinely warm expression she had seen from him all day. "Overstepped, yes, I think that would be an accurate description. The question is what to do about such unprecedented behavior." Eleanor felt her heart sink as she realized that despite everything, she might still face dismissal for her presumption. The irony was bitter. She had saved her master's fortune only to lose her own livelihood in the process. Yet even facing such a prospect, she could not bring herself to regret her actions. "I understand, sir," she said quietly, "that my conduct today was improper, regardless of the outcome. I am prepared to accept whatever consequences you deem appropriate." Mr. Blackwood studied her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time despite their years of daily interaction. "Tell me, Eleanor, how did you really know to look at that telegram? Your explanation about your father's business experience was plausible, but I suspect there was more to it than that." The question caught her off guard, and she found herself struggling to formulate a response that would be both truthful and prudent. I have always been observant by nature, sir. In my position, one learns to notice small details that others might overlook. And what details led you to suspect that document was fraudulent?" Eleanor hesitated, knowing that her answer would reveal just how thoroughly she had been watching and analyzing his private affairs. "Your behavior as you read it, sir. You returned repeatedly to certain sections with expressions of concern, and you seemed troubled by elements that the lawyers dismissed as routine. It suggested to me that your instincts were warning you of danger, even if you could not identify its precise nature." He nodded slowly, as if this explanation satisfied him more than her previous one had. "You were watching me very carefully indeed. Most people in service learn to see without observing, to be present without noticing. Your approach appears to have been quite different." "Yes, sir," she admitted, though the confession made her feel exposed and vulnerable. "I fear I have always been too curious for my own good." "Curiosity," he mused, "is not generally considered a virtue in domestic service. It makes employers uncomfortable to think that their staff are studying them so closely." Eleanor felt a fresh wave of apprehension wash over her. "I meant no impropriety, sir. I have never violated your privacy or betrayed any confidences. It is simply my nature to observe and remember." "I believe you," he said, though his tone remained thoughtful. "But it raises certain questions about your continued employment in this household." The words struck her like a death sentence, confirming her worst fears. She had indeed saved him from disaster, only to destroy herself in the process. The prospect of seeking new employment at her age, with no references, and the inevitable whispers about her dismissal from the Blackwood household was so bleak that she felt momentarily dizzy with despair. "However," Mr. Blackwood continued, and Eleanor felt a flicker of hope reignite in her chest, "it also suggests that your talents have been considerably underutilized in your current role." She looked at him with confusion, unable to interpret the meaning behind his words. "Sir?" He moved away from the window and took a seat in one of the leather armchairs that flanked the fireplace, gesturing for her to take the chair opposite, a breach of protocol so significant that it left her momentarily speechless. "Sit down, Eleanor." What I have to say requires a conversation between equals, not a dialogue between master and servant." The instruction was so extraordinary that she hesitated, uncertain whether she had heard him correctly. The notion of sitting in her master's presence, addressing him as an equal, was so foreign to her experience that she scarcely knew how to proceed. "Please," he said more gently, "sit. You have earned the right to hear what I have to say in comfort." Slowly, scarcely believing what she was doing, Eleanor lowered herself into the chair. The leather was soft and warm beneath her, so different from the hard wooden chairs of the servants' quarters that she felt almost guilty for enjoying its comfort. "Eleanor," Mr. Blackwood began, "what happened today has made me realize several things. First, that I have been living in dangerous isolation, surrounded by servants who, however loyal, lack the knowledge and courage to challenge my decisions when they see me heading toward disaster. Second, that I have in my household a woman of remarkable intelligence and integrity who has been wasting her talents on duties that any competent person could perform." Eleanor listened to these words with growing amazement, scarcely able to believe that such praise could be directed at her. Yet there was something in his manner that suggested he was entirely serious, and she found herself hoping against hope that this extraordinary day might lead to something better than mere survival. "What are you suggesting, sir?" she asked carefully. "I am suggesting that your position in this household should be reconsidered. Your quick thinking and courage today have saved me from complete ruin. But more than that, your intelligence and observational skills represent assets that I would be foolish to waste." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "I don't understand what you mean, sir." Mr. Blackwood leaned forward in his chair, his expression intense and earnest. "I mean, Eleanor, that I would like to offer you a position as my personal secretary and advisor. Your duties would include reviewing business correspondence, analyzing contracts and proposals, and providing me with your honest assessment of people and situations that require my attention." The offer was so unexpected, so far beyond anything she had dared to dream, that Eleanor found herself momentarily speechless. To be elevated from domestic service to a position of trust and responsibility was a transformation so profound that she could scarcely comprehend its implications. "Sir," she managed at last, "I am deeply honored by your offer, but I must ask, are you certain that such an arrangement would be appropriate? The change in my status would surely cause considerable comment, both within the household and beyond." A shadow crossed his features, and she saw him acknowledge the validity of her concern. "You raise a fair point. Such an unusual arrangement would indeed provoke gossip and speculation. However, I believe I have found a solution to that problem as well." Eleanor waited, her heart pounding with anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. "My ward, Miss Catherine, will be returning from her studies within the month. I have received a letter informing me that she has completed her degree with highest honors and is eager to return home. When she arrives, I intend to offer her a formal position managing certain aspects of my business interests, a role that will require competent assistance." Understanding began to dawn in Eleanor's mind, and with it came a surge of hope so intense that it was almost painful. "You mean to present my elevation as support for Miss Catherine's new responsibilities?" "Precisely. You would serve officially as her assistant, but in practice, you would be reporting to me on all matters of significance. Miss Catherine is brilliant and capable, but she is also young and idealistic. She will benefit from having an advisor with your experience and judgment, while you will benefit from the legitimacy that such an arrangement would provide." Eleanor found herself overwhelmed by the elegance of the solution. To work alongside Miss Catherine, whom she had always admired and respected, while exercising her intelligence in matters of real importance, it was more than she had ever dared to hope for. "There is, however," Mr. Blackwood continued, his expression growing serious, "one significant complication that we must address. The men who were here today will not simply disappear because their scheme has been exposed. Professional criminals of their caliber do not accept defeat gracefully, and I fear they may attempt to take revenge upon those who have thwarted them. The reminder of Mr. Cromwell's whispered threat sent a chill through Eleanor's newly buoyant spirits. You think they will try to harm us? I think they will look for opportunities to cause trouble, certainly. They may attempt to discredit you or me, or they may try more direct forms of intimidation. We must be prepared for such possibilities. Eleanor felt a familiar weight settle upon her shoulders, the burden of consequences that followed from necessary but dangerous actions. Perhaps, she said slowly, it would be wiser for you to withdraw your offer. My association with this affair may make me a liability to your household. But Mr. Blackwood shook his head firmly. On the contrary, your involvement makes you more valuable, not less. You have seen these men at work, observed their methods, and recognized their deceptions. That knowledge may prove crucial if they attempt further mischief. The logic was sound, but Eleanor could not entirely suppress her anxiety about the future. She had made powerful enemies today, and she knew from bitter experience that such men had long memories and patient natures. There is something else, Mr. Blackwood continued, that you should know before you make your decision. The position I am offering you comes with considerably greater compensation than your current role, enough to ensure your independence should circumstances ever require it. The mention of financial security was almost as startling as the offer itself. Eleanor had lived her entire adult life on the edge of destitution, dependent entirely upon the goodwill of others for her survival. The prospect of earning enough to achieve true independence was so foreign to her experience that she could barely comprehend it. How much greater? She asked, though the question felt almost impertinent. £50 per annum, with lodging and meals provided as before. The sum was so far beyond her current wages that Eleanor felt momentarily dizzy. £50 per year would make her a woman of modest but genuine means, capable of supporting herself with dignity should she ever choose or need to leave the Blackwood household. Sir, she said, her voice trembling with emotion, such generosity is far more than I deserve. You deserve it and more, he replied firmly. Today you saved me from losing everything I have worked to build. The compensation I am offering represents only a fraction of what your intervention was worth to me. Eleanor found herself struggling to contain tears of gratitude and relief. After so many years of uncertainty and dependence, the prospect of security and meaningful work seemed almost too wonderful to be real. I accept your offer, she said at last, with gratitude that I cannot adequately express. Mr. Blackwood smiled, a genuine expression of warmth that transformed his austere features. Excellent. We shall begin immediately with a thorough review of all my business correspondence and contracts. I suspect that if criminals of this caliber targeted me once, they may have attempted similar schemes before, perhaps with more success. The thought was sobering, and Eleanor realized that her new responsibilities would involve far more than she had initially imagined. She would be entering a world of high finance and commercial intrigue where the stakes were enormous and the players often ruthless. There is one more matter we must address, Mr. Blackwood continued, his expression growing grave once more. The threats made against you today cannot be taken lightly. I intend to hire additional security for the household, but you must also be personally vigilant. These men know who you are and where to find you. The reminder sent another chill through Eleanor's body, but she forced herself to appear calm and composed. I understand, sir. I shall be careful. See that you are. Your courage today has earned my eternal gratitude, but I would prefer that you exercise more caution in the future. We cannot afford to lose you, now that we have discovered your true worth. As Eleanor rose from her chair to return to her duties, though she was no longer entirely certain what those duties might be, she reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in the space of a single morning. She had awakened as a powerless servant, dependent upon others for her very survival, and she would sleep tonight as a woman of position and influence, with meaningful work and financial security assured. Yet even as she savored this remarkable change in her fortunes, she could not entirely banish her awareness of the dangers that lay ahead. She had made enemies of men who would not hesitate to destroy her if given the opportunity, and she would need to be constantly vigilant if she hoped to survive and prosper in her new role. The game, as she was beginning to understand, was far from over. Indeed, it had only just begun. The weeks that followed Eleanor's elevation from servant to trusted advisor passed with a swiftness that seemed almost dreamlike in its intensity. Her new quarters, a suite of rooms on the second floor that had previously housed visiting dignitaries, afforded her luxuries she had never dared to imagine. A private sitting room, with tall windows overlooking the gardens, a bedroom furnished with mahogany pieces that spoke of quiet elegance, and most precious of all, a small study lined with books where she could pursue her new responsibilities in comfort and privacy. The transformation in her daily routine was no less remarkable than the change in her surroundings. Where once she had risen before dawn to begin the endless cycle of cleaning and serving, she now spent her mornings reviewing correspondence, analyzing business proposals, and preparing detailed reports for Mr. Blackwood's consideration. Her quick intelligence and natural aptitude for such work had proven even greater than he had anticipated, and she found herself entrusted with matters of increasing complexity and importance. Yet, even as she reveled in the intellectual stimulation and security of her new position, Eleanor remained acutely aware of the shadows that hung over the household. True to Mr. Blackwood's predictions, the defeat of Cromwell and Thornfield's scheme had not marked the end of their troubles. Strange incidents had begun to occur with disturbing regularity. Deliveries that arrived damaged or not at all, mysterious letters containing veiled threats, and reports from the household staff of strangers lingering near the property at odd hours. Most unsettling of all had been the discovery, just 3 days previous, that someone had attempted to enter the mansion through a rear window during the night. The would-be intruder had been frightened away by the new security measures Mr. Blackwood had implemented, but the incident had served as a stark reminder that their enemies remained active and determined. It was against this backdrop of tension and uncertainty that Miss Catherine Fairfax returned from her studies abroad, and Eleanor found herself both eager and apprehensive about this long-awaited reunion. She had known Catherine since the young woman was a child, had watched her grow from a precocious girl into a formidable intellect, but the dynamics of their relationship would necessarily be different now that Eleanor occupied a position of greater authority and responsibility. The carriage that brought Catherine home arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon, when the trees in the garden had donned their finest golden raiment and the air carried the promise of winter's approach. Eleanor watched from her study window as the elegant conveyance drew up before the main entrance, and felt her heart quicken with anticipation as the door opened to reveal the young woman who had been the brightest light in this often somber household. Catherine Fairfax, at 23, was everything that Eleanor remembered and more. Tall and graceful, with auburn hair that caught the afternoon sunlight like burnished copper and eyes of such a vivid green that they seemed to hold the essence of spring itself, she possessed a beauty that was enhanced rather than diminished by the intelligence that blazed forth from her every gesture and expression. She moved with the confidence of one who had conquered academic challenges that would have daunted many men. Yet there remained about her an warmth and vivacity that made her immediately approachable. Eleanor made her way to the main hall just as Catherine was embracing her guardian with obvious affection, and she felt a familiar surge of maternal pride at the sight of the reunion. Mr. Blackwood, for all his stern demeanor, had clearly missed his ward deeply, and the joy on his face as he held her was a reminder of the gentler aspects of his nature that were rarely displayed to others. "Eleanor!" Catherine exclaimed upon catching sight of her, and before Eleanor could properly respond, she found herself enveloped in an embrace that spoke eloquently of the genuine affection that had always existed between them. "How wonderful to see you again. Uncle Alexander has written to tell me of your new position, and I cannot tell you how delighted I am that we shall be working together." The warmth of the greeting did much to allay Eleanor's anxieties about their changed relationship. Catherine had always possessed the rare gift of treating those around her with respect and kindness, regardless of their station, and it appeared that her university education had only strengthened these admirable qualities. "Welcome home, Miss Catherine," Eleanor replied, though the formality of the address felt strange after such an affectionate greeting. "We have all missed you greatly." "Oh, none of this Miss Catherine nonsense," the young woman laughed, her eyes sparkling with mirth. "We are to be colleagues now, are we not? You must call me Catherine, as you did when I was a child, or I shall never feel properly at home again." The easy acceptance of their new dynamic was a relief beyond measure, and Eleanor felt some of the tension she had been carrying begin to ease. Perhaps this transition would prove less awkward than she had feared. The evening that followed was one of the most pleasant Eleanor could remember in years. At Catherine's insistence, she joined the family for dinner, another breach of traditional protocol that spoke eloquently of how thoroughly their old arrangements had been transformed. The conversation was lively and wide-ranging, touching upon Catherine's academic achievements, the current state of Mr. Blackwood's business interests, and the various improvements that had been made to the household during her absence. It was only after they had retired to the drawing room for coffee that the conversation turned to more serious matters. Catherine, it quickly became apparent, had inherited her guardian's keen intelligence and was not to be satisfied with superficial explanations of recent events. "Now then," she said, settling herself comfortably in her chair and fixing Eleanor with an expectant gaze, "Uncle Alexander has told me something of the dramatic circumstances that led to your elevation, but I should like to hear the full story from your own lips." Eleanor glanced at Mr. Blackwood, who nodded encouragingly and proceeded to relate the events of that memorable morning. Catherine listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking penetrating questions that revealed both her quick understanding and her appreciation for the complexities of the situation. "Extraordinary," she murmured when Eleanor had finished her account. "You showed remarkable courage, Eleanor, and even more remarkable judgment. Many people might have recognized that something was amiss, but few would have possessed the presence of mind to act so decisively." The praise was gratifying, but Eleanor found herself more interested in Catherine's analytical assessment of their current predicament. "What concerns me now," she said, "is that these men are clearly not finished with us. The incidents of recent weeks suggest that they are seeking some form of revenge for the failure of their scheme." Catherine's expression grew thoughtful. "Yes, Uncle Alexander has briefed me on these developments. Professional criminals of this caliber rarely accept defeat gracefully, and they may well view your intervention as a personal affront that requires retaliation. The question," Mr. Blackwood interjected, "is what form such retaliation might take. Direct violence seems unlikely, too risky and too difficult to execute without detection. But they might attempt to discredit us professionally or socially, or they could try to strike at our financial interests through more subtle means." Eleanor had been giving considerable thought to this very question, and she had reached some conclusions that she was reluctant to voice. "Sir," she said carefully, "I fear that their primary target may be myself rather than you or your interests. I am the one who exposed their scheme, and I am also the most vulnerable to attack." The observation was met with a silence that confirmed her fears. She was indeed the weak link in their defenses, a woman of humble origins whose elevation to her current position was both recent and precarious. An assault upon her reputation or person would serve the dual purpose of satisfying their desire for revenge, while demonstrating to others the consequences of interfering with their operations. All the more reason Catherine said firmly, "to ensure that your position is made as secure as possible. I intend to make it clear to everyone we encounter that you are not merely my assistant, but my valued colleague and friend. An attack upon you will be viewed as an attack upon our entire household." The loyalty implicit in this declaration moved Eleanor deeply, but she could not entirely suppress her concerns about the dangers such solidarity might bring to Catherine herself. These men had already demonstrated their willingness to threaten and intimidate. She could not bear the thought that her situation might expose others to similar risks. As if reading her thoughts, Mr. Blackwood leaned forward in his chair with an expression of grim determination. "Eleanor, you must understand that we are all in this together now. Catherine and I have discussed the situation at length, and we are agreed that the best defense against these scoundrels is to present a united front. They succeeded in targeting me initially because I was isolated and vulnerable. They will find it much more difficult to operate against a household that is alert to their methods and prepared to defend itself." The logic was sound, yet Eleanor could not entirely banish her unease. She had learned through bitter experience that those who opposed powerful and ruthless men often paid a terrible price for their courage, and the thought that her actions might bring harm to those she cared about was almost unbearable. It was Catherine who provided the key insight that began to transform their defensive posture into something more proactive. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "it occurs to me that we may be approaching this situation incorrectly. We have been thinking in terms of defending ourselves against their attacks, but perhaps we should be considering how to take the offensive." Both Eleanor and Mr. Blackwood looked at her with interest, and she continued with growing excitement. These men attempted to defraud Uncle Alexander through systematic deception, and they have since engaged in harassment and intimidation. Moreover, Eleanor observed evidence suggesting that this was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of criminal activity. Surely such behavior falls within the purview of law enforcement. Eleanor felt her heart quicken at the suggestion. "You mean to report them to the authorities?" "Precisely. We have evidence of their attempted fraud, documentation of their threats, and testimony regarding their suspicious behavior. With Eleanor's knowledge of their methods and my connections within legal circles, we might well be able to build a case that would see them prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." The boldness of the proposal was both thrilling and terrifying. To move from defense to attack, to transform themselves from victims into prosecutors, would require courage of a different order entirely. Yet Eleanor found herself drawn to the idea with an intensity that surprised her. "It would be dangerous," Mr. Blackwood observed. "If we move against them unsuccessfully, their retaliation could be severe. But if we do nothing," Catherine countered, "they will continue to operate with impunity, victimizing others as they attempted to victimize us. More than that, they will remain a constant threat to our own security and peace of mind." Eleanor found herself thinking of all the other potential victims who might fall prey to such schemes. Men and women whose trust would be systematically exploited, whose life's work would be stolen through carefully crafted deceptions. The thought that she might have the power to prevent such tragedies was both humbling and inspiring. "I believe Catherine is right," she said at last. "We have a responsibility not only to protect ourselves, but to ensure that these men cannot continue to prey upon others." The decision, once made, seemed to energize all three of them. They spent the remainder of the evening planning their approach, with Catherine drawing upon her legal education to outline the evidence they would need and the procedures they would have to follow. Eleanor contributed her detailed observations of the criminals' methods and behavior, while Mr. Blackwood offered his knowledge of the business community and his connections with law enforcement officials. The weeks that followed were among the most intense and purposeful of Eleanor's life. Working closely with Catherine, she compiled a comprehensive dossier on Cromwell, Thornfield, and their associates, drawing upon every detail she had observed and every fragment of evidence they had gathered. Catherine's legal training proved invaluable in organizing this material into a coherent case that could be presented to the authorities. The breakthrough came when they discovered that several other wealthy individuals had been approached with schemes remarkably similar to the one that had nearly ensnared Mr. Blackwood. Two of these men had actually signed contracts and lost substantial sums before discovering the fraudulent nature of the enterprises they had been induced to support. Their willingness to come forward with testimony added crucial weight to the case Eleanor and Catherine had assembled. The arrest of Cromwell and Thornfield, when it finally came, was conducted with a swiftness and efficiency that spoke eloquently of the authorities' long-standing interest in their activities. It emerged that the two men had been under investigation for months, but the evidence provided by Eleanor and her allies gave prosecutors the ammunition they needed to move decisively. The trial, which took place in the following spring, became something of a sensation in the newspapers. Eleanor found herself thrust into an unwelcome spotlight as the key witness whose courage and quick thinking had exposed the conspiracy. But Catherine's support and guidance helped her navigate the public attention with dignity and grace. The conviction of both men on multiple charges of fraud and conspiracy brought a satisfaction that Eleanor had not expected to feel so deeply. Justice had been served, but more than that, she had played a crucial role in ensuring that these predators could no longer victimize the innocent and unwary. In the months that followed the trial, Eleanor settled into her new life with a contentment that had long seemed impossible. Her work with Catherine proved both stimulating and rewarding, involving projects that ranged from charitable endeavors to business ventures designed to provide employment for those in need. Her financial security allowed her to assist other women in circumstances similar to her own former situation, and she found deep satisfaction in using her position to open doors for those who might otherwise remain trapped in poverty. The relationship that developed between herself and Catherine transcended the traditional boundaries of employer and employee, becoming instead a partnership built upon mutual respect and genuine friendship. They complemented each other perfectly. Catherine's theoretical knowledge and social connections, balanced by Eleanor's practical experience and hard-won wisdom. As for Mr. Blackwood, the events of that transformative year had changed him as profoundly as they had changed Eleanor. The recognition of how close he had come to utter ruin had tempered his pride with wisdom, while his observation of Eleanor's courage and capability had opened his eyes to the talents that might lie hidden among those he had previously regarded as mere servants. The household that emerged from this crucible was one transformed by the recognition that worth and intelligence were not confined to any single class or station. Eleanor's elevation had created a precedent that led to similar opportunities for others, and the Blackwood mansion became known as a place where merit was recognized and rewarded regardless of its origins. Yet perhaps the most remarkable transformation of all was in Eleanor herself. The frightened, powerless woman who had once lived in constant fear of destitution had been replaced by someone who moved through the world with quiet confidence and purpose. She had discovered not only her own capabilities, but her capacity to make a meaningful difference in the lives of others. On quiet evenings, when she sat in her comfortable study, reviewing the day's work or planning for tomorrow's challenges, Eleanor often reflected on the strange chain of events that had brought her to this place. A moment of moral courage, a willingness to risk everything for the sake of what was right, had opened doors she could never have imagined. The broken teacup that had provided her first opportunity to speak had been replaced by a beautiful service of her own, a gift from Catherine to commemorate their partnership. But Eleanor never forgot the lesson of that shattered porcelain, that sometimes the most important moments in life arrive disguised as accidents or disasters, and that courage, once summoned, has the power to transform not only our own circumstances, but the world around us. The morning light that now streamed through the tall windows of her study carried with it no mockery of her former sorrows, but rather the promise of meaningful work and purposeful action. Eleanor Hartwell had found her place in the world at last, and in doing so, she had helped others find theirs as well. The game, as she had once thought of it, was indeed over, but the victory belonged not to those who would prey upon the innocent, but to those who possessed the courage to stand against them. And in that victory, Eleanor had discovered the greatest truth of all, that real power lies not in wealth or position, but in the willingness to act with integrity when action is most needed and most dangerous. The paper that might have destroyed everything had become instead the catalyst for a transformation that elevated not only Eleanor's circumstances, but the very nature of the household she served. In the end, her warning had saved far more than Alexander Blackwood's fortune. It had saved his soul, and in the process, revealed her own.